Hey, this is James for VFX Nomad, and we are continuing with our little canyon project. Alright, what else do we need to do to be able to render this out? Let's think about this for a second. What do I want to do once I've got this out? So the first thing is I don't want the reference bolt in there. That's fine. Second thing that I want is maybe I want to be able to pick one jet and then another jet so that I can do some color correction later on. The main thing that I don't want to do here, that I probably want to do in Nuke, is going to be the motion blur. So the motion blur is going to require me to output some motion vectors for Nuke to read what's happening. And apart from that, they're going to be the main utility things. So let's just set that up, and then we can decide how to render this guy before we all fall asleep. So click on the layer, motion vector, yes. Depth, there we go, yes. And what was the other thing that I said? Oh, I want some IDs. Okay, so I've got these, and then what I may decide that I want over the top of these is some of these AOVs. So let's add a couple of them. And then indirect, specular glossy, okay, there we go. So we've added a few AOVs, some of which we may not use, but some we might. And if you wanted to look at them, there's our diffuse reflection, there's your glossy reflection. I don't need to read out the title of each of these paths. Anyway, whatever. So there we go. If we look quickly at the motion vector is blank. That's not because the AOV is broken. In Clarisse, you need to turn on, well, you need to tell it what kind of motion blur you want it to output, because by default it's doing nothing. So on the path tracer, go to the very bottom, and here it asks you what motion blur mode that you want. Currently disabled. We want motion vectors, so we're going to turn on just motion vectors. Everything goes blue. Doesn't mean a lot to us, but it means something to Nuke. So just make sure that we have something in there. Our depth is nice and red, and we have stuff in the other channels. That's all cool. So last but not least, we're going to want an ID for this little puppy over here. The fastest way I know how to get an ID for something like that would be to actually give it its own shader. I would like to be able to click on it and just say, hey, or whatever, but doesn't seem to work like that. So I'm going to change the names a little bit. I'm going to call it ship 1 and ship 2. Impressive, I know. There we go. And we're going to go back to our shading layer editor. We're going to need to create one more layer. And the order that these guys are in does matter. It's going to calculate this first, second, third, fourth, etc. If I pop this new entry, sorry, I'm zoomed in, so it's kind of splitting. It's thinking. So here we go. Ship 1. Ship and ship 1. We go to this material here. What we're going to do is on this metal material, we're going to duplicate it. Oops. We have to duplicate it this way. Control C, Control V. And we are going to give them IDs. This metal here, the final part of the node, the metal PBR, we're going to look at it here in the material editor. Now, this is really the first time we've actually looked at what we're plugging in. These shaders are from the Isotropix guys. We're not going to go into them in depth, but what you should try and understand from this is that this is layering them all together. And what they've done is they've given you different parts which are all layering on top of each other. So from one, you're going to get the diffuse. From another one, you're going to get the specularity. From another one, you're going to get the clear coat. You layer all those things together in kind of this uber thing, and then you apply that to your whatever. Personally, I like it when there's a shader, like a generic shader, which has maybe your diffuse, spec, and clear coat just built in, because I'm duplicating shaders constantly and I don't have to don't like having to keep plug this in. But hey, this is the way it works for the minute. The only part that you need to be able to change at this moment is to drag in an AOV store. An AOV store plugs into this arbitrary output variable, so AOV, and you can give it a color. For us, we're just going to make it red. So we have red going into this coordinates channel. Probably don't want it in the coordinates channel. It would make more sense to be in an ID channel. To do that, we just make a new channel. So edit channel layers, which is under there. So add layer. We're just going to say ID, I don't know, 1. ID 1. There we go. Red, green, blue. And that's it. All we've done is we've now created a new slot. So if we click on the little looker thingy and we go to the very bottom, ID 1 now exists. What we've now said is output red on ID 1. We plugged it into this metal PBR. We now need to go back to where we were. We look down at the bottom and we say, this layer, we want to output ID 1. It's a bit two-step. We're going to repeat it in a second. But if we look at ID 1, we can see that our jet over there on the right is indeed red. We come back, take a quick look. We're okay. Look again at our shading layer editor. We have a white jet here because we've taken its name, ship 1, and we've not plugged anything into it. What I wanted to plug in was this duplicate here. So I have called it metal 1, and then we're going to drag and drop it in here. Taking a quick look at metal 1 in the material editor. What we're going to want to do here is make metal 1. We have this one red, so we want this one to be green. We do it the same way. Drag the AOV store in. You say, we want you to be green. And we want you to output to the ID 1 channel. Here we go. So now we have a red one and a green one. Go over this one more time. What we're going to do is we're going to assign an ID to the plants. Plants should be over here somewhere. We have a plant layer in here. Same as before, we have an AV store. We drag and drop it in here. We want it to be red. But this time we want it to go out to ID 2, not ID 1. ID 2 does not exist yet. So we create it. You can press Control L, or you can go over here, Image, Edit Channel Layers, and add a layer. Give it a name, ID 2, to keep it interesting, and then red, green, and blue. Save. We want that to be rendered, right? Because at the moment we're not rendering it. We've made it. It's empty. We can see it's empty because it's gray, but we do want to render it. Okay, great. We're rendering an empty layer. At this point, we can say you're red, and we want you to output to, not ID 1, James, ID 2. And then we plug that into the shader. So anything using that will now output red on ID 2. Let's have a quick look. There you go. There are your plants. Check our depth. Yep, we have a depth channel. Everything else is pretty good. So the next thing that we're going to want for sure is to get rid of these spheres. These spheres, we don't need them in our final render. So to do that, we know where they came from. We have these layout combiners, our layout group. Instead of trying to make a rule to get rid of them, I just switch this to object list. Keeps everything in it that used to be there. And now allows us to just turn those two guys off. Both of them. There we go. What? Third time lucky? Okay. Now it is not rendering with the spheres in it anymore. We've come to a point where we're just about ready to launch this thing off. So we need to have a quick think about what we're doing setting wise. We have this set to 3 and 3. That might be okay if you have a strong enough machine, but if you're like me and you have a laptop or whatever or something that's not very strong and you don't want to sit here forever, you might want to break this into 2 separate groups. Or if you just want them separately in the first place. So we're going to want one group, which is the ships. We're going to duplicate this. We want another group. That's going to be the layout. Right. So for the ships, we just want you to render the geometry of the ships. We don't want to render everything else. For that, it's quite easy because we already have our ships in their own group. So we just say you are ships. And for this one, we say we just want you to render the layout, which is just here. So if we just look at the ships layer, there's our ships. We just look at the layout layer, no ships. Why is that useful? Because now we can create a second path. Well, let's just duplicate this. We have path tracer 1, and we can drop this to 1 sample. It's probably a bit too low, to be honest, but that's what we're going to use so that we can finish this exercise. So now this renders with one path tracer, this renders with another. Okay, last but not least, we need to tell it to output to somewhere. So we'll zoom out for a second. Go here, layout, we want you to render to disk. I'm going to give you a path. So we'll say go to the renders and we'll give it an interesting name, layout, and then do the same thing here. Our render ships. Save. Okay, we're good to go. At this point, you're going to hit the render button, go back dinner or whatever, maybe even come back in the morning, and you will have your image sequence. In the next part, we're going to take that image sequence, stick it in Nuke, and then put some little bits and bobs with it, such as we'll use the motion vector, we'll put an image sphere in there, probably throw a couple light wraps on things. Not go too much into it, but we're going to make it look relatively decent. So click render and off we go.